Welcome back to the deep dive, where we take that massive stack of sources you've shared with us and really just trying to cut straight through the noise
Subscribe to my channel.
to the core insights.
Hmm.
Today, we're tackling one of life's most persistent and I think universally recognized paradoxes.
It really is.
We all know the mantra, right? To succeed, especially in, complex or demanding environments, you have to collaborate. You have to admit you don't know everything.
Right. Asking for help is always touted as a sign of maturity, of being a team player, a sign of strength even.
Exactly, strength. And in many cases, it's indispensable for reaching the highest levels of achievement.
And yet, here's the paradox.
Yeah.
If seeking aid is so beneficial, if it's so necessary for success, why does it trigger such a profound internal resistance in us?
Yes.
I mean, why is that email asking for 5 minutes of someone's time feel heavier than tackling the entire project all by yourself?
That's it. That psychological friction, that sort of innate reluctance is exactly what we're digging into today. Absolutely. And we're moving beyond just the logistical hassle of scheduling a meeting or figuring out who the right person to ask is. We're exploring the hidden price tag we pay.
The mental and social price tag.
Yes. Every single time we open ourselves up to that vulnerability.
Our sources today really center on this foundational, and I mean highly influential, piece of social psychology research.
The 1980 study.
The 1980 study by Bella DiPaolo and Jeffrey Fisher, titled The Costs of Asking for Help. And this paper was just groundbreaking because it moved past all the speculation.
Right.
It systematically explored the specific, measurable, psychological and social costs that are associated with seeking aid. Their mission was to map that hidden calculus we all do in our heads.
It's a brilliant setup. So our mission in this deep dive is to deconstruct their model. We need to understand the three major categories of potential fallout
That's right.
that the help seeker runs through in this subconscious cost-benefit analysis.
And this includes, the internal threats to your self-respect, the very specific, measurable burden that you're placing on the helper.
And how the task itself changes everything.
Yeah, how the nature of the task, is it hard, is it easy, is it relevant to your identity, can completely warp that whole cost-benefit equation.
We'll see that the decision isn't just, can I do this, but more like, what will I lose if I succeed with help, and what social price will I pay if I fail all alone?
It's a fascinating look at how deeply, deeply ingrained that value of self-reliance is in our decision-making.
Okay, so let's start with the most personal dimension of this whole calculus, the costs that are entirely internal. These are the ones the help seeker pays, whether they ask for help from a human being or, an impersonal source.
Right, like a repair manual or a book.
Exactly. Whether you're consulting a brilliant colleague or just looking up the answer in a super dense manual, these are the threats to your own feelings of competence and self-respect.
This is where the core motivational drivers really are. The researchers identified that, before we even think about the social interaction, we anticipate a loss of our own internal reward.
And the first one they identified is just crucial for anyone involved in high-stakes projects, whether you're in academia or a corporate setting, the cost of credit reduction. Explain what that means fundamentally.
The fundamental cost here is, it's the expectation that a successful outcome that you achieve with aid will just inherently yield less credit.
Less praise.
Less praise, exactly, than when you accomplish completely on your own. It's a dilution of your personal achievement. If the goal is X and you achieve X with help, your internal metric, it just subtracts the contribution of the aid you received.
And this dilution of credit, it can hit us in two places, right? Externally and internally. Let's talk about the external cost first.
The external one is pretty straightforward, and it's often institutionalized. This is when company procedures or, say, academic rules, they explicitly alter the payoff structure.
So like a bonus or something.
Yeah, maybe in a joint project, you get less pay, a smaller bonus, or fewer academic points compared to if you'd successfully done the whole thing solo.
And the study we're reviewing tested this directly, right? They put a clear academic penalty in place.
They did. They told the subjects, look, if you use the graduate student's help to get a correct answer, you only get half a point.
But if you figure it out yourself,
you get a full point, exactly.
Yeah.
They basically monetized the help. The explicit rule was aid equals credit reduction.
And the prediction was, what, that people would just avoid it?
The expectation, which was totally confirmed in the results, was that if you anticipate being penalized, even a tiny bit, for success you get with help, you will naturally seek less help.
It's just a rational economic response to a penalty.
It is. If success with help only gets you a 50% reward, and success without help gets you 100%, the incentive to avoid help becomes crystal clear, even if using that help guarantees you get that 50%.
I think this resonates so deeply in the modern workplace. I mean, we talk constantly about collaboration,
All the time.
but then performance reviews are almost always structured around individual contribution. If I ask my teammate for heavy assistance on my assigned part of a project, I might succeed, but that success is now, diminished in the eyes of my manager.
Or worse, the credit is split.
The credit is split. We've built a system that simultaneously demands teamwork, but penalizes the very evidence of that team dependence.
That's a critical application. The institutional structure itself often reinforces this psychological barrier. But as you mentioned, the cost of credit reduction can also be internally imposed.
And that's often more potent.
I think so, yes.
This is the subjective feeling of personal gratification, isn't it? It's the difference between doing it and really doing it yourself.
Precisely. This is all about self-satisfaction. Even if the world showers you with praise, even if the external credit is 100%, if you know deep down that you didn't conquer that mountain alone, your internal reward system just gives you a lower score. You might feel less deserving, less proud, or, just simply less satisfied.
And that feeling taps right into our culture.
Oh, absolutely. This internal cost taps directly into a Western cultural socialization that heavily stresses self-reliance, mastery, and independence.
That idea, an internalized credit reduction, it drives so many things, like the reluctance to use AI tools for creative work, even when they're way faster.
That's a perfect example.
You might get the outcome, but that feeling of authorship, of genuine accomplishment, it's diminished. And if that internal gratification is lessened, the motivation to use the tool that caused it just plummets.
The cost-benefit analysis shifts. Even if the aid guarantees success, it's the psychological tax on effectiveness.
And this leads us right into the second major internal cost they found.
Threats to competence. Seeking help is, at its most basic level, an admission that your current resources or your skills are insufficient for the task at hand. And that is inherently competence-threatening.
But the DiPaolo and Fisher study and all the literature around it, it shows that this threat isn't constant. It's particularly pronounced under very specific conditions. And this is where we get the nuance that truly explains why we resist.
What's fascinating here is how the context of the task itself just acts as an amplifier. The researchers highlighted two conditions where asking for help becomes especially threatening to an individual's feelings of competence.
And thus becomes a powerful deterrent.
A very powerful deterrent.
The first one seems a little counterintuitive on the surface. Condition 1, easy tasks. Why is asking for help on an easy task more threatening than asking for help on a hard one?
Because if the task is exceptionally simple, something that the seeker, the helper, and society at large all agree that everyone should be able to do,
Right.
then seeking aid suggests a fundamental, profound, and systemic lack of skill. It's not a failure because of complexity. It's a failure because of basic inadequacy.
I can relate to that instantly. If I'm doing, advanced calculus and I ask for help, I'm competent, but I'm just stuck on a complex problem. But if I ask for help locating the send button on an email program I use every single day, that suggests complete functional deficit.
Exactly. The difficulty of the task gives you a ready-made external reason for failure. The task was complex.
An excuse.
An excuse. But if the task is trivial, the only possible reason for needing help is internal. I am incompetent. And so the humiliation factor just skyrockets.
So the seeker recognizes that they're signaling a far more severe deficiency when they ask for help with something trivial.
They do. And the second condition relates directly back to our identity. Condition 2. Important tasks or high ego involvement.
This is a deep psychological break.
It is. If you believe it's crucially important for you to be skilled at a particular task, if that task validates or defines a core part of who you are, then asking for help becomes existentially competence-threatening.
Like the example from the source,
Yeah.
the aspiring auto mechanic who is deeply invested in their identity as someone who can work on cars.
That's it. That mechanic is repairing their own car. If they fail, they are a bad mechanic.
Yeah.
They ask for help. They are admitting they are not what they claim to be.
Their whole identity is on the line.
The stakes are incredibly high. The task is central to their self-concept. And you see this in professional settings constantly.
Oh, yeah.
Think of a financial analyst whose defining trait is their meticulous attention to detail. They will fight tooth and nail to fix their own complicated spreadsheet error long after a quick 5-minute external review could have solved it.
And why?
Because asking for help on that task is the same as admitting, I am not meticulous. My core trait is compromised.
So if the task validates a core part of your professional or personal identity, the psychological stakes of admitting failure or even just needing a little assistance, they just skyrocket.
It becomes an act of self-preservation to avoid seeking help in that scenario.
And this naturally brings us to the bridge between these purely internal costs and the social costs that come next.
The connecting impersonal versus interpersonal costs.
Right. When you seek help from an impersonal source, a repair manual, a database, an AI, you pay those internal costs. You feel less credit, you feel that shame of inadequacy.
But the damage is contained. It's just you.
It's just in your own head. But when you seek help from another person, an interpersonal source, those internal costs are exponentially compounded.
Absolutely.
Wow.
The shame isn't just a private conversation in your head anymore. Not only do you feel inadequate in your own eyes, but you now risk a definitive, potentially lasting loss of perceived competence in the eyes of the help giver.
This is the moment when the competence threat becomes a social reality.
It transitions from a personal fear into a relationship dynamic.
The moment I ask you for help with that trivial task, I have provided you with undeniable social evidence that I lack a fundamental skill.
And that potential for negative social evaluation, the judgment that goes along with the act of seeking aid that forms the first part of the social calculus we have to explore now. It's the fear that the helper will not just assist you, but will categorize you, judge you, and potentially derogate you.
So we've established that the seeker pays a significant internal psychological price-reduced credit, threatened self-concept. Now we introduce that second array of costs, which only materialize when you ask another person for help.
The burden you place on the helper, and the resulting feeling of obligation for the seeker.
This is where the decision to seek help stops being purely about efficiency and becomes a strategic social maneuver.
It really does. When you consider asking a person for help, you have to run this immediate, intuitive simulation of the helper's costs and rewards.
You're trying to guess what they're thinking.
You are. And the DePaulo and Fisher research predicted, and later confirmed, that individuals deciding whether to seek help are actively taking into account the cost-reward contingencies of their helper. They're anticipating their reaction.
Let's start with the direct imposition. The costs to the helper, or the giver cost. How does this framework define costly aid?
Aid is defined as costly if the helper is interrupted, imposed upon, or, otherwise inconvenienced.
And that inconvenience usually takes the form of what? Time.
Time, energy, emotional labor, or the interruption of a personal goal. The study emphasized that this variable giver cost is often the overriding consideration in so many real-world helping situations, yet it had been profoundly underassessed in previous research.
Which focused more on the person asking.
Yes, it often focused purely on the recipient's need.
But wait, if we are in a collaborative environment, a team, a family, a classroom, shouldn't the expectation be that assistance is just freely given? Why should the cost be such a major psychological factor for the person asking?
That's a great challenge, and it really gets at the difference between ideal organizational norms and, psychological reality. While the norm might be free assistance, the reality is that the helper's resources, their time, their focus, their energy, are finite.
Right.
The seeker understands intuitively that asking for aid is essentially asking the helper to reallocate their finite resources away from their own goals and toward the seeker's. And that is an imposition, even if it's done willingly.
And when that imposition is high, the seeker risks two major negative consequences, even if they end up getting the help.
First, there's the obvious one. The greater risk of refusal. If the aid is costly, the helper is just more likely to say no. And that refusal is a tangible social rejection, which the seeker anticipates and tries to avoid.
So if I see you are demonstrably busy, buried in work, I'm less likely to ask for a favor. Not because I don't need it, but because I'm trying to protect myself from the sting of you saying no.
Precisely. But even if the helper cannot refuse, let's say due to professional obligation or, as in the controlled experiment where they are instructed to be available.
Right.
The seeker still risks a negative future interaction. That helper might comply reluctantly, but that resentment over the interruption or the inconvenience, that's a form of negative social capital.
You might get the immediate answer you needed, but you pay for it later when that person is cold to you in the hallway or less likely to want to collaborate with you next time.
It's a transaction with deferred social interest due.
That's a good way to put it.
The source notes that reluctant compliance might foster negative feelings toward the help seeker, which could adversely affect the quality of any future interactions. The seeker gets the aid, but they incur a social debt that damages the long-term relationship.
And that concept of debt takes us directly to the emotional fallout for the seeker, the aversive state of indebtedness.
Yes.
If I know I just seriously inconvenienced you, if I force you to put down your dissertation to help me, I feel obliged. And the research confirms this is an intrinsically aversive or unpleasant state.
Indebtedness is maybe the most powerful hidden psychological cost in this whole social calculus. Seeking aid that is costly to the helper inevitably incurs greater feelings of obligation for the help seeker.
And we don't like that feeling.
No. Previous research, which DiPaolo and Fisher leveraged, established that this feeling of indebtedness is a negative motivational state. We are highly motivated to escape it.
Why do we feel that indebtedness so strongly? Is it simply about, fairness?
It's more complex than just simple fairness. It's about maintaining social equilibrium and our own self-image. Being indebted implies dependence, and dependence threatens that core cultural value of self-reliance we talked about earlier.
It makes the seeker feel unequal to the helper.
Exactly. And furthermore, the debt creates social pressure to reciprocate, which is a future burden you have to carry around.
And this was particularly relevant in their experimental design.
Oh, yes. The study was specifically designed to maximize this aversive state in the high giver cost condition. The key was that ad was costly. The graduate student, Lisa, was busy, and the recipient had no immediate clear opportunity to reciprocate.
So you couldn't just pay it back right away.
Right. If you could immediately buy Lisa a coffee or solve one of her problems, the debt would be lessened. But in this scenario, the seekers were just left hanging, unable to balance the scales.
And that happens all the time in the real world.
It's a critical factor in professional contexts. Often, the junior person asking for aid from a senior executive has no immediate way to repay that highly costly time commitment. The debt just festers.
So the core prediction here, the absolute foundation of the study, was that people anticipate this cost structure and they just try to avoid incurring the debt.
The critical prediction was simple, yet fundamental. Less help will be sought when giving aid is costly to the donor than when it is not costly.
And this gives real weight to the argument.
It provides empirical weight to the argument that help seekers are actively calculating the cost-reward contingencies of the person they are considering imposing upon. It elevates the decision from a logistical problem to a strategic social transaction.
And what this implies is that our decisions about asking for help are often driven less by our own genuine need for assistance and more by our perception of the helper's schedule. If I need help equally badly on Monday and Friday, but I know you're stressed on Monday, I will wait until Friday, even if waiting hurts my own outcome.
That's the precise trade-off. It forces us to understand help seeking not just as a failure to cope, but as a risk-averse behavior designed to preserve both our social relationships and our own psychological comfort.
Okay, let's get into the evidence. DiPaolo and Fisher didn't just speculate. They designed a highly controlled and, frankly, clever experiment to test these variables directly.
Yes.
We need to go into detail on how they set this up, as the methodology itself is crucial for understanding the results.
Absolutely. We start with the overview of the experimental setup. The study involved 64 undergraduate women who participated individually. They were told the study was about their ability to decode interpersonal messages, a highly relevant skill in college and later careers.
And the tasks were deliberately chosen to be highly involving. Why was high involvement so important for the tasks?
Well, if the tasks were boring or trivial, the subjects just wouldn't care about their performance. And therefore, the internal costs, the threats to competence, the loss of credit, they wouldn't be engaged.
They had to care about the outcome.
They had to care. By making the tasks relevant to interpersonal sensitivity, a desirable trait, they ensured subjects were intrinsically motivated to do well and thus highly vulnerable to the psychological costs of seeking aid.
So what were the specific tasks they used to measure this sensitivity?
They worked on two 30-item tasks. The first was the pictures task, which used items for the profile of nonverbal sensitivity, or the PONS test.
The PONS test, right?
Yeah, the PONS test is a standard measure where subjects have to judge the emotional effect being expressed.
And what kind of effects were they judging? Not just happy or sad, I assume.
No, these were complex social emotions. They had to judge things like positive dominant, negative submissive, expressing gratitude, or asking forgiveness.
Okay, very nuanced.
Very. And these judgments were made based on isolated photographs of a woman's face, or just her body posture. This meant they were evaluating subtle, hard-to-read nonverbal cues.
And the second task was more verbal.
Correct. The descriptions task required them to judge relationship types like dislike, ambivalent, from brief transcript excerpts of people describing other people.
So that tested their ability to decode verbal contextual information.
And it contrasted nicely with the nonverbal challenge of the pictures task.
And the helper, this Lisa, she was clearly positioned to maximize the authority dynamic.
Yes, the bogus helper, Lisa, was established as an expert graduate student who had previously scored exceptionally well on the very tasks the subjects were now completing.
So that reinforces the competence gap.
It does, and it made the potential for derogation being judged by a superior much higher. And crucially, the dependent measure was the number of items the subject circled for which they wanted Lisa's help later.
Why was it important that the subjects were required to approach Lisa, regardless of whether they asked for help or not?
That's a key methodological control. They wanted to ensure that the results measured reluctance to seek aid, not simply generalized social timidity or, avoidance of the helper.
Got it.
By forcing an interaction, they isolated the cost of the request itself from the generalized cost of the interaction. If subjects asked for less help, it was because they were resisting the costs of aid, not because they were just shy.
That sets the stage beautifully. Let's dive into the results of the two key cost manipulations, starting with the impact on the giver.
Okay, so we look at giver cost. The manipulation centered on Lisa's supposed schedule, which was conveyed via this subtle, handwritten note attached to her materials.
So detail that manipulation for us.
In the high-cost condition, the note implied a severe imposition. It stated that Lisa was busy working on her dissertation during the consultation time.
The implication is clear.
Very clear. Interrupting her would disrupt a major, high-stakes academic endeavor. In the low-cost condition, the note stated she had no special plans during the period.
And the manipulation checks confirmed that subjects really did see her as busier.
They did. They rated the high-cost Lisa as significantly more busy, demonstrating the manipulation worked.
So the subjective experience of the helper's busyness was successfully managed, and the result was stark.
The result was direct empirical confirmation of the social calculus theory. Subjects asked for significantly less help in the high giver cost condition than in the low giver cost condition.
A robust difference.
A very robust difference. Even though the subjects were highly involved in the tasks and needed the assistance, their fear of imposing on a busy helper and all the attendant risks of refusal or social debt, it substantially lowered their request rate.
This proves that anticipating the helper's inconvenience is a major, often overriding determinant of our help-seeking behavior. It explains why, when a superior says, "My door is always open," we often still hesitate if we see their calendar is just packed.
Exactly. The open door is meaningless if the implicit giver cost is sky high. Now let's look at the recipient's cost, the penalty for using help, or the asker cost manipulation.
And this focused on the cost of credit reduction.
It did. They made the penalty academic, focusing on that 1-point versus 12-point credit.
So in the high-cost condition, correct answers with Lisa's help were worth half a point.
Right. Only 1/2-point credit. Correct answers achieved alone were worth a full point. But in the low-cost condition, they got a full point for correct answers, regardless of whether they used help.
That's a clear, externally imposed penalty on the outcome. What was the result?
As predicted, subjects asked for less help in the high asker cost condition.
So it works.
It works. It confirms that the internal psychological mechanism that anticipated loss of full reward is powerfully triggered by external penalties. Even a small, measurable penalty for success with aid acts as a significant deterrent to seeking necessary assistance.
It tells us that preserving the purity of the credit is often prioritized over maximizing the score.
It is.
This is a devastating insight for anyone running collaborative programs. If you introduce any perceived mechanism, formal or informal, that diminishes the credit for a collaborative success, you are actively introducing a deterrent to collaboration itself.
Precisely. The system has to reward the outcome achieved with help as highly as the outcome achieved alone, or that credit reduction cost will just kick right in.
So moving beyond the cost variables, the research also did a deep dive into the manipulation of task difficulty.
Yes, and this is absolutely critical because difficulty is the primary driver of the need for help. They needed to see how need interacts with cost.
The researchers first observed an overall general task difference. What was that?
They found that subjects asked for more help on the pictures task than on the descriptions task. This was actually unpredicted, but it offered some immediate interpretive opportunities.
What was their guess as to why?
The researchers speculated that subjects might just have lower confidence in their ability to interpret nonverbal cues, so the pictures, compared to their ability to interpret verbal transcripts.
Especially college students.
Especially college students who rely so heavily on verbal skills, or, maybe the nonverbal stimuli were just inherently more ambiguous. Regardless, they were seeking help where they felt less confident.
And within the pictures task, they identified 2 types of inherent difficulty. Let's start with content difficulty.
Content difficulty was defined by what the subject was judging. Previous studies had shown that faces are easier to judge accurately than body posture in this PNS test.
So judging body language was harder.
Exactly. Judging effects from body language was designated as the slightly more difficult content, and the result showed slightly more help-seeking on the more difficult body items than on the easier face items.
Which just affirms the common sense idea that people ask for help when the task is hard.
Right. And the second type of difficulty was form difficulty, which related to the structure of the response options.
This is a more subtle point.
It's a more subtle technical point, but it was highly influential in the results. Form difficulty related to the structure of the task itself, specifically the similarity of the response alternatives.
So the multiple choice options.
Exactly. Items were harder if the incorrect alternatives were confusingly similar to the correct answer. For instance, if the correct answer was positive dominant, but the incorrect options were positive submissive and neutral dominant.
Very similar.
Very similar effects. Accuracy dropped markedly. When the options were dissimilar, it was easier to be accurate.
So similar options meant high difficulty, forcing a finer discrimination. What did they find?
As strongly predicted, there was substantially more help-seeking on items with the more difficult response alternatives, the harder form, compared to those with the easier dissimilar alternatives.
This demonstrates that help-seeking is highly responsive to the perceived complexity of the task structure, not just the content.
That's right. They then synthesized this by doing a correlational analysis, linking actual task inaccuracy to help-seeking. And for the pictures task, they found a significant relationship.
Why was it?
Items on which subjects were more inaccurate were the items with which subjects were more likely to ask for help, which is a necessary finding. It confirms that the subjects were trying to remedy genuine difficulties.
But the source notes that this strong relationship was statistically weak for the descriptions task. Why the difference there?
And this is a crucial detail for understanding the role of perception. The discrepancy suggests that difficulty needs to be perceived clearly by the subject for help-seeking to correlate strongly with actual difficulty. In the descriptions task, the verbal content might have appeared more homogeneous, or perhaps because the response alternatives were identical for every single item in that task. Subjects' perceptions of which items were genuinely difficult might not have accurately matched the actual difficulty level.
In other words, if you don't realize you're struggling, you don't ask for help.
You don't?
We only seek aid when the difficulty is manifest and acknowledged internally. The hypothesis that subjects will ask for more help on difficult problems is only fully supported when perceived difficulty aligns with external reality.
Exactly. Perception is reality when it comes to the cost-benefit analysis of help-seeking.
Now let's get to the central finding that ties the whole study together and provides the deepest support for their theory: the nuance of giver cost and difficulty. The interaction. What happens when the helper is busy and the task has varying levels of difficulty?
This interaction effect is really the heart of the paper. They found that in the high giver cost condition, when Lisa was preoccupied with her dissertation, the rate of help-seeking was relatively low on items that were difficult by both criteria.
Content and form.
Content and form, yes. And also on items that were easy by both criteria.
Okay, let's slow down and process that. When the helper is busy, the seeker avoids 2 categories of problems: the trivially easy ones and the overwhelmingly hard ones.
Yes.
They're essentially seeking help only for the problems that are just right, the moderate difficulties.
That is the precise counterintuitive finding. Compared to items that were difficult on only one of the 2 criteria, say hard content but easy response alternatives, subjects hesitated to seek help on the extremes when the helper was preoccupied.
Let's break down the logic of that reluctance at both extremes, starting with the easy problems. If the problem is too easy, why is the seeker reluctant to interrupt the busy person?
That goes right back to the giver cost and the fear of social judgment. If the problem is too easy, trivial, the seeker doesn't want to bother a preoccupied person with a request that just doesn't warrant the interruption.
They anticipate being judged.
Yes, for their lack of basic competence, the condition 1 threat we discussed earlier, and judged for the triviality of the imposition. It doesn't justify wasting the helper's valuable time.
That makes perfect sense. I don't want to look incompetent and be wasteful of your time. Now, for the counterintuitive part, why avoid asking for help on the problems that are too hard? The ones where aid is clearly justified by the content.
This provides such strong support for the complex social calculus people perform. If the problem is too hard, by both content and form criteria, the seeker anticipates that it would take the helper an especially long time to solve.
Ah.
They hesitate to take up too much of the busy helper's valuable time. This avoidance is driven by the fear of accruing maximum indebtedness and maximizing the giver cost.
Wow. So the seeker is actually calculating the potential duration of the imposition. They're protecting themselves from becoming an abusive burden on a preoccupied person.
Yes.
They're saying, I need help, but this particular problem would cost Lisa too much, so I'll just try to struggle through it myself.
It's a sophisticated act of weighing self-interest against perceived social responsibility. When the giver is busy, the seeker doesn't just evaluate the need for help. They calculate the time investment the request will require from the helper.
And they try to find that sweet spot.
They strive to find that sweet spot. Difficult enough to justify the request and mitigate the competence threat, but not so difficult that it feels like an insurmountable, socially irresponsible imposition. This one finding is perhaps the deepest insight into the human reluctance to impose on others.
And this applies so powerfully to digital communications. If I send an email with a huge complex question that requires 10 paragraphs of response, I'm imposing a massive giver cost. If I send a very simple question, I am risking a high competence threat. We spend so much time framing and reframing the request to fit that moderate zone.
Where the cost to the giver is acceptable and the need for the seeker is justifiable. And that framing time is a hidden cost of the help-seeking decision itself.
Okay, now let's shift gears to understand how personal characteristics affect this reluctance to seek aid, specifically focusing on identity and what the measured psychological toll is once help has actually been sought.
We revisit task centrality, or ego involvement.
We talked about the abstract idea of the aspiring auto mechanic, but how did the researchers measure this concept in a concrete experimental setting?
This was one of the truly innovative parts of their methodology. Instead of trying to experimentally manipulate the subject's self-esteem, they used a naturalistic index of involvement that was tied directly to the subject's academic identities.
They took the students' declared academic majors.
They did. And then 3 independent judges were asked to rate the various academic majors on a 9-point scale according to how important it would be for a person in this major to be sensitive to the feelings and emotions of other people.
So a psychology or social work major would get a high score.
A high score for centrality, as interpersonal sensitivity is vital to that field. A math or engineering major would receive a lower score.
This established the centrality of the experimental task to that student's professional identity. It tied the task outcome right to their career aspirations.
Precisely. And the prediction was that subjects majoring in areas where interpersonal sensitivity is highly valued would be less willing to ask for help.
Because it threatens their core competence.
It directly threatens a core required competence for their future career. The condition 2 threat, writ large across their entire life plan.
And what was the result of this naturalistic measurement?
As predicted, subjects for whom the task was highly central to their major were, though slightly less likely to ask for help.
So it held up.
It held up, and it aligns perfectly with previous findings in social psychology, suggesting that individuals actively resist seeking help on tasks related to their core traits, like intelligence or mental health, or, in this case, professional defining skills.
And the source highlights that this was the first time this had been shown.
The first successful demonstration of this centrality effect using naturally occurring involvement rather than artificially manufactured variables.
It's such a powerful finding because the analysis showed these ego-involved subjects weren't actually significantly better at the task than the other subjects.
No, they weren't.
They were resisting necessary aid purely to protect their own self-concept.
The psychological cost was simply too high. They prioritized identity preservation over optimizing their performance.
And in a professional sense.
This explains why senior leaders, whose identity is tied to expertise and decisiveness, often struggle so disproportionately to ask for advice, even on problems outside their specialty. Their resistance is stronger, not because they are inherently better at every task, but because the admission of inadequacy is a greater threat to their role centrality.
Finally, let's look at the emotional cost that is paid after the decision to seek help has been made. What were the psychological consequences of seeking help?
Right. So the post-experimental phase assessed subjects' feelings about approaching the helper and, crucially, their expectations of how the helper would view them.
And the critical findings came from relating the amount of help sought to these subsequent feelings.
Yes. The correlations.
Let's start with the anticipation of judgment competence perception.
Subjects who asked for more help expected the helper, Lisa, to view them as less competent. The correlation was significant and negative.
So that fear of being judged incompetent by the expert helper is a primary psychological cost of seeking aid.
It is. The more dependent you are, the lower you expect your status to fall in the helper's eyes.
And this fear is bad enough if it's just internal, but the source includes a detail that is, frankly, kind of disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
They noted that data from other studies suggest these subjects' perceptions of derogation by the helper may be quite accurate reflections of reality.
That is the chilling context provided by the broader literature, particularly research focusing on the recipient and donor dynamic.
So it's not paranoia.
The findings suggest that the seeker's anxiety about being viewed as incompetent is not necessarily paranoia. It is often rooted in an accurate social expectation. The act of helping can sometimes elevate the helper's status at the expense of the recipients.
Wow.
Helpers, having expended resources, may subconsciously or even overtly rationalize the aid-seeking behavior by viewing the recipient as deficient, thereby justifying their own expenditure and reinforcing their own superior status.
That's a brutal, self-reinforcing social loop. You need help, but getting it may guarantee you'll be judged negatively by the helper.
And you know this on an intuitive level.
This expectation must feed directly into the final emotional consequence. Just generalized discomfort.
It absolutely does. Discomfort and nervousness. Subjects who asked for more help felt more nervous and more uncomfortable about approaching the helper for advice.
And this discomfort is likely a multi-layered response.
It is. It's linked to the expectation of derogation. You're anticipating an unpleasant social interaction where you will be judged as inferior.
But the research also suggested a second possibility for this nervousness, didn't it?
Yes. The nervousness may simply be a function of a general, deeply ingrained reluctance to inconvenience another person, even if that person is explicitly not busy, as in the low giver cost condition.
So it reflects fundamental social norms about self-reliance.
It does, which suggests that the aversion to imposition and the aversion to appearing incompetent are almost inseparable components of the help-seeking anxiety.
The psychological toll is just immense. The decision to ask for help requires overcoming the fear of internal inadequacy, the fear of social imposition, the fear of external judgment, and the aversive state of indebtedness, all bundled into one deeply uncomfortable emotional state. This explains perfectly why we delay, we deny, and we procrastinate on seeking necessary assistance.
So, to synthesize these phenomenal findings from DiPaolo and Fisher, the study provided this empirical, detailed evidence that the decision to ask for help is governed by a complex, high-stakes calculation.
Right.
The help seeker is intuitively balancing three core categories of cost, and they're often prioritizing them over the practical benefit of actually achieving the goal.
And we've seen those costs broke down into 1, internal costs like threats to self-respect and the reduction of credit for success. 2, social costs associated with the burden placed on the giver, leading to the risk of refusal and social debt. And 3, the resulting psychological toll, including that fear of negative evaluation and competence derogation.
The strength of this research really lies in its measurable consequences. It gives us 4 specific and, I think, surprising takeaways that fundamentally change how we should view this everyday human behavior.
Okay, first, the self-imposed penalty, the loss of credit for success achieved with aid, is a powerful and measurable inhibitor. We are inherently less likely to pursue success if we know we won't get full satisfaction or credit for it.
Which really challenges the entire structure of meritocracy that claims to value only outcomes, when in fact we value the purity of the inputs just as much.
Second, the calculation of the helper schedule, the giver cost, is a paramount determinant of the seeker's behavior. We are actively assessing the cost-reward structure of our potential benefactors.
And this leads to that strategically reduced help seeking when the helper is busy, prompting the seeker to avoid problems that are either too trivial or too burdensome, thus aiming for that justifiable, moderate difficulty level.
Third, the task's centrality to one's identity makes us disproportionately resistant to seeking help. We prioritize protecting our self-concept, our ego involvement, over practical goal attainment, even when we are not demonstrably more skilled.
This is the psychological barrier that fuels imposter syndrome and keeps so many people stuck fighting battles they shouldn't fight alone, simply to maintain a facade of capability.
And finally, the emotional consequences are demonstrably real. Seeking more help directly correlates with anticipating negative self-perception, feeling nervous and uncomfortable, and anticipating negative external judgment.
Believing the helper views you as incompetent. And since the broader literature suggests these anticipated judgments may be accurate reflections of reality, this psychological barrier may be the single largest, most overlooked impediment to obtaining necessary aid in competitive settings where credit reduction and busy helpers are the absolute norm.
The takeaway for you, the learner, is profound. We are often deterred from seeking the help we need, not because the solution is unavailable, but because the psychological and social costs are simply too high for our ego to bear. This has been a phenomenal deep dive into the human resistance to vulnerability. We started with the idea that asking for help is necessary, but this study shows that the psychological and social penalties for doing so are often severe, measurable, and highly anticipated. It's no wonder that sending that request feels like scaling a mountain.
It raises a powerful final question for you, the listener, to mull over. The study revealed a reluctance to seek aid, even when the helper was explicitly available, in that low giver-cost condition, which suggests the barrier is less about external convenience and more about deeply internalized values of self-reliance and the fear of the competence threat. If its psychological barrier is so strong that it outweighs even low external costs, then how often does this deeply ingrained social calculus prevent you, specifically, from achieving optimal success, and at what cost to your long-term productivity and potential? The fear of judgment may be the quiet saboteur of our greatest ambitions.